An Australian theologian and an Italian agnostic join forces to investigate one of history's most explosive questions. Has the Bible been mistranslated to conceal ancient encounters with non-human intelligence? Paul Wallis and Mauro Biglino examine evidence that the theology of God in the Old Testament was a late addition to far older traditions, traditions which preserved memories of advanced beings, lost civilizations, and forgotten technology. Discoveries in China, Japan, India, Benin, Cameroon, Turkey, and Iran cast a surprising new light on the biblical texts. Out of radically different worldviews, Wallis and Biglino arrive at strikingly similar conclusions to challenge traditional beliefs about human origins, human potential, and our place in the cosmos. Probably the most controversial question that we ask in the Dragons of Eden: was God an idea imported into scriptures that already existed, scriptures that had existed for hundreds of years without any word for God in them, scriptures that were originally about something completely different? And if so, where's that idea for God come from? And if so, what were those stories originally about? In the Dragons of Eden, Mauro Biglino and I argue that there wasn't even a word for God in the Hebrew scriptures for hundreds of years until around 280 to 100 BCE. And at that point, the Greek word theos was introduced into the Bible at the production of the Septuagint. Prior to the arrival of that word, what were those scriptures really about? Because they weren't about God as you or I would understand that word. The Greek word theos means God, the source of the universe, that in which we all live and move and have our being. And this is a definition that the New Testament writers are very comfortable with. But it didn't exist in the Hebrew scriptures until this period of translation into Greek. So what were those scriptures about? In my previous books of the Eden series, I show that those stories are about the Elohim, the powerful ones, and that the Hebrew stories of the Elohim are often echoes of Mesopotamian stories of Dingir, Anunnaki, Igigi, Apkallu. And many of these beings are named within the biblical texts. So we have El Shaddai, El Elyon, Yahweh, Baal Hadad, Milcom, Chemosh, Dagon, Asherah, and they exist within a world that scholars describe as a polytheistic vision of the world. I argue that these stories come from a time when our ancestors had contact with advanced beings, whom the Bible calls Elohim. This is the first book in the Eden series that I've co-authored, and I've written it with Mauro Biglino, who is a world-renowned biblical scholar who for many years translated interlinear texts for the Edizione San Paolo. And the work of an interlinear translator is very exacting because you have the Hebrew in front of you and you're not supposed to interpret it as such. Just give a very fundamental roots meaning rendering of what those words mean so that the scholar can look at that and then compare it with translations that have interpreted the texts. And so one has to be very precise, avoiding importing anything into the text, simply opening up what the words themselves really mean. So that was the work of Mauro Biglino for many years with the Edizione San Paolo, and their chief client was the Roman Catholic Church, and so these really had to be Vatican-approved translations. Through his work, Mauro reached very similar conclusions to me about the meaning of the Elohim and Yahweh stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. When I published the first of the Eden series, Escaping from Eden, I was fairly confident that I was understanding these ancient Hebrew scriptures correctly by reading them alongside their sources, the ancient stories from Sumer, Babylonia, Arcadia, Assyria. But I couldn't see any other theologians out there who were arguing for what I was saying in Escaping from Eden. And so I felt a little bit exposed as I approached publication of that book. And it was only just before I published Escaping from Eden that I first started hearing the name Mauro Biglino. And I was so encouraged to learn that there was someone with really serious bona fides in the translation of Hebrew who concurred with my interpretations and had had the courage of his convictions to have published on the subject in Italian. Now, I knew that the theologians that I had dialogued with in producing Escaping from Eden, any of those who supported my views would be very unlikely to do it in public. So it was a great relief to find Mauro and think, okay, there's someone else on this track who is very difficult to gainsay in terms of his expertise in Hebrew. And so really Mauro and I were destined to meet, and now we've worked together. We collaborated on The Fifth Kind and produced a series of documentaries about key words in the Bible and what to do with some of these mysterious words that hint at ancient technology, non-human intelligence, and close encounters with non-human beings in the deep past. How do we handle those? Traditional translators have generally failed to recognize emblems of technology in the scriptures. They've tried to present everything as a religious or a spiritual story. We argue that these words like ruach, kavod, tub, kirimashato, kirimapaso, Yahweh, El Elyon, Elohim, Bn Ilm, are best left untranslated so that you can see the words in the text and then watch how they behave so that the reader can work out what a ruach does and how it behaves, what a kavod is and how it behaves. Mauro and I actually come from very different start points. Mauro is an Italian agnostic. I'm an Australian theologian. And yet, when we apply our logic to these strange words, these anomalies in the stories of the Bible, we reach very, very similar conclusions. I would say there's about a 90% overlap in our conclusions. In The Dragons of Eden, we've left a couple of sections where he and I have slightly different views, which I think makes it interesting for the reader. But where we're agreed is that the Bible is full of stories of our ancestors' encounters with a non-human intelligence, stories that we have mistaken as God's stories. And when we mistake these as God's stories, we make terrible mistakes as to what we think God is. And we end up with a God who is a monster, a God who is xenophobic, a God who is violent, a God who is unforgiving, a God who cannot be reasoned with, a God who was so uncomfortable to live with that the tribes of Israel tried to get rid of him and replace him with a human king. None of this makes sense. While we read these ancient stories as if they're all theology, Mauro and I argue that many of these stories are not theological stories at all. They are stories of paleo-contact. Paleo-contact is the hypothesis that our ancestors experienced contact with advanced non-human civilizations in the deep past, and that the cultural memory of these encounters is evidenced in ancestral story around the world. In The Dragons of Eden, we drill down into passages where the non-human identity of the Yahweh character is very, very clear. Mauro and I show that we are reading later redactions of earlier stories, and that in the earliest form, these stories were not presenting any kind of theological claim at all. And so we have stories of colonies of human beings being terrorized by bizarre non-human entities who would govern through the constant threat of immolation, continually demanding tribute of gold, cattle, sheep, virgin girls, a pattern which runs in parallel with Dragon's story all around the world. 1 Samuel 8, the story that speaks of the leaders of the tribes of Israel trying to sack Yahweh and replace him with a human king, that follows the pattern of medieval dragon story. Why is that? Why are there so many draconic descriptors scattered throughout the Bible as they describe various Elohim? They talk about the huge size, its thick, impenetrable skin, a reptilian-like skin, prodigious appetite for inhaling the smoke from burned cattle and sheep, demands for gold, virgin girls, governance through the threat of immolation, wings, flight feathers, flight ability, a long fire-breathing snout. If you put all those attributes together and ask a child, what am I describing? They'll tell you straight away, oh, that's a dragon. Now, if this were in an ancient Celtic story or a Saxon story, an Armenian story, an African story, you would say, okay, it's simple. Those are the descriptors of a dragon. When we find them in the Bible, what do? We turn them into metaphor, we turn them into poetry, and neglect to ask, is this history? Is this theology? Is this a story about God? Or is it a story about something else? Ras Shamra is the modern name of the archaeological site of ancient Ugarit, located on the Syrian coast near modern Latakia. There in 1928, a farmer, Mahmoud Mellah, was ploughing his field when his ploughshare became caught by a stone under the soil. As he examined it, Mahmoud quickly realized he was looking at the tip of an archaeological iceberg. Within 12 months, French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer was on the scene. In the first year of excavations, he uncovered the city of Ugarit, his royal palace, and thousands of tablets, some etched in Akkadian cuneiform, and some in Northwest Semitic, the ancestor of Biblical Hebrew. The tablets included myths, rituals, legal arrangements, and diplomatic correspondence. In these documents, written sometime in the 13th century BCE, we find a council of superhuman beings named the Bn Ilm, headlocked in competition and internal conflicts over their agendas for Project Humanity. Bn Ilm is the Ugaritic way of saying Bene Elohim. What's significant about the finds at Ugarit is that they give us a kind of a midpoint between the ancient Mesopotamian stories and the biblical stories. They give us an insight as to who the Bene Elohim were. And this council of mysterious beings sounds very much like the Council of Anunnaki in the Archeological or in the Enuma Elish. In the Bible, the Bene Elohim first get a mention in Genesis 6, when they are abducting human beings and hybridizing with them. And yet through the ages, biblical translators have tried to forget these parallels, treat the Bene Elohim as if they've never heard of them before, and present them as if they are angelic or spiritual kind of entities, except when they're perpetually warring against each other, and when thousands of human beings are getting slaughtered in the conflicts between the Bene Elohim, doesn't sound too angelic, doesn't sound so spiritual. And in Genesis 6, of course, we've got the hybridization story. How can they be spiritual beings if they're doing a physical thing, such as producing hybrid offspring? These stories sound absolutely bizarre, but they are not unique to the Bible. Genesis 6 echoes the Mesopotamian stories. Similar stories are told by other cultures all around the world. Might it be better to go back to those texts, leave Bene Elohim untranslated, and see what it is they get up to in the Bible, and then draw conclusions about them? In the 1920s, archaeologists Leonard Woolley, Henry Hall, and others working in modern-day Iraq began surfacing a trove of mysterious figures. At Tel al-Ubaid, near the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, as well as at Eridu, as well as in other sites around the region, excavations revealed what appeared to be an ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of the Asherah figurines. Asherah figurines have been unearthed in prolific numbers at archaeological excavations right across the Levant. Like the Asherah dolls, the Ubaid figurines were small, handheld devotional figurines. The figurines date from around 5000 to 4000 BCE. Archaeological excavations across the Levant have surfaced similar figures. Now, the tribes of Israel had handheld dolls which they used at harvest festivals to give thanks to the advanced beings who had introduced their ancestors to agricultural science and all the accoutrements of civilization. The tribes of Israel celebrated Asherah, and they had handheld dolls of Asherah, bare-breasted, an obvious figure of fertility, the fertility of people, the fertility of the land. At Ubaid, the figures are different. They seem to fulfill the same function, but these advanced beings who gifted agricultural science to the Amorites, the Philistines, the Eblaites, are not human. Look closely at the skin, and there are markings that suggest reptilian skin. It was Leonard Woolley who first named them the lizard people. Look at the shape of the head, the shape of the eyes. It's a reptilian head. And so we have this anomalous being, something that looks like a reptilian being, and yet it's breastfeeding. In the past, we'd have very confidently said, well, they are an impossible being. In the same way, we'd have said a dragon is an impossible being. A reptilian being with feathers does not exist, we would have confidently said. And therefore, when we come across stories of feathered serpents in China, or in the Yucatan Peninsula, or in the Bible, or in the Mesopotamian corpus, we know straight away this is not a memory of anything real, this is pure fiction, because you cannot have a reptile with feathers. Until 1861, when excavations in Germany surfaced Archeopteryx, which was a feathered reptilian. In 1996, we excavated sinosauropteryx in China, another feathered reptilian. Today, if you look at an illustrated book of dinosaurs, you'll see that creatures ranging from a velociraptor to a T-Rex believed to have had full feather systems. So whereas in the past we were so confident there's no such thing as a reptile with feathers, it's an impossible being, now we discover it was among the alpha species of our planet for 168 million years. That's how wrong we can be. And so when we read of anomalous creatures, non-human intelligence, draconic sounding beings, and say that's clearly fiction, maybe we should be a little bit more humble about what we think is and is not possible, especially if we're considering the possibility that some of these encounters were with beings from another world. I hold to the theory of panspermia, which was held by Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of the double helix of DNA. And that belief is that the genetic coding for biological, conscious, and potentially intelligent life is as endemic to the cosmos as are the properties of light and gravity. And that means that whenever that coding lands in an amenable environment, a planet with water, a planet in the Goldilocks zone, it will produce forms of life similar to the ones with which we're familiar on planet Earth, and others that may be quite different. But what we can say today is that there is coding for reptilian skin, there is coding for feathers, there is coding for mammary glands. And we may be familiar with what's around us on planet Earth, We don't know what combinations of genetic coding might have generated in other parts of our galaxy. Now, our ancestors were willing to talk about that. For many of us today, there's still a ridicule factor around this. Even now, with all the tranches of documents being released by US military intelligence. Now, in what's being released, we're still seeing a lot of fuzzy videos, fuzzy photographs. I would like to see the high-resolution video and the high-resolution images that are on SIPR and JWICS. Why are we not being shown those? Why are we not seeing photographs of the non-human biologics whose existence was attested to at the July 2023 House Oversight Subcommittee hearing of July 26th? The answer to that question may be that there are some in the world of military intelligence who are worried about ontological shock. Now, ontological shock, if I can liken it to the life of a lion knows how to be the alpha predator. It knows how to live right at the top of the food chain, knows how to navigate the savannah, how to raise a pride, how to socialize, how to hunt, how to feed. Introduce a new alpha species into the savannah, something far more powerful than the lion. Say it's now full of T-Rexes. How does the lion now behave? When the savannah is full of T-Rexes, it no longer knows how to walk through the savannah, how to hunt, how to feed, how to raise a pride. It knows how to be the alpha species, doesn't know how to exist as a mid-ranking mammal. There are people who are concerned that human beings might go into ontological shock if they suddenly realize we're not the alpha species of our galaxy. Some fear that we're going to go into a state of paralysis or panic. I don't hold to that view at all, because through my journeys in ancestral story, world mythology, I've learned that our ancestors were able to process that idea just fine and go on with their lives. In the Bible stories of Elohim, in the Mesopotamian stories of Anunnaki, Apkallu, Dingjir, Igigi, in the Mesoamerican stories of feathered serpents, we have the cultural memory of people who had processed this idea that we have company, that we've always had company, that we are not the alpha species, and that we may be oversighted by galactic neighbors even to the present day. If our ancestors could handle such far-reaching ideas, I'm very confident we can. And it's a big motivator behind my books, and in particular The Dragons of Eden, that people who read the Bible should not be at all surprised when we start talking about contact experiences and non-human intelligence in the present. What we're being offered in these ancient stories is a kaleidoscope of story that goes back 10,000, 60,000, 120,000, 300,000 years. We've been around all that time as human beings, and we've carried ancestral story with us all the time. And those stories are all layered into these ancient texts. And that's part of what Mauro and I dissect as we look at the texts of the Bible. Some argue that figures of monsters or dragons in mythology exist only as ideations or ways of speaking about hidden dangers and the problem of evil. Many of the draconic characters of our ancestral stories are actually goodies. So the monsters that were first seen on the banks of the Red Sea, according to Berossus, the ancient Greek Babylonian priest, they turn out to be sages. They turn out to be helpers of humanity. They are the ones, says Berossus, who introduced the ancestors to agricultural science, civil engineering, mathematics, cosmology, written language, record keeping, banking, money systems, legal systems. They turned out to be beings that enabled a fabulous leap forward in the living standard of human beings on planet Earth. So those monsters were not monsters in that sense. The dragons of the Mesoamerican stories are a more layered story. On the one hand, they were our masters in those stories, but on the other hand, they supported the development of Homo sapiens. We could say the same about the Ubaid figurines. They may be reptilian beings, but they represent the gift of fertility to people and to the land. Equating dragons with evil isn't right. Go to China. Listen to the story of the 4 dragons and the Jade Emperor. Those dragons are associated with ecological recovery, saving humanity after a catastrophe, something like the Younger Dryas Cold Period, the most recent ice age. Those stories said that we had help in that moment from advanced non-human beings. And the Chinese iteration of that story and the Aboriginal Australian iteration of that story give credit to draconic beings for helping us in those moments. Every year I take groups to the Van and Bitlis provinces in Turkey because there I find Iron Age carvings, a whole lexicon of symbols, and ancient cuneiform inscriptions that all refer back to the deep story of humanity. They talk about this great leap forward into agricultural science. Before that, we lived in animal subsistence on the planet's surface. With agricultural science comes larger, high-density populations, megalithic building, city building, a specialized society, and the flourishing of all kinds of arts and sciences. In the carvings and inscriptions at Ayanus, in the inscriptions retrieved from Kefkalesi, we find Iron Age story carrying an ancient cultural memory of this moment in human history. And I'd love you to come with me this October from the 8th to the 18th. Go to ancientknowledgetours.com, get a place on the tour, and I will show you these sites personally and talk through how we approach the interpretation of these symbols and texts. The Iron Age people of these lands, the Urartian people, the Bn Ilm, did not claim to have face-to-face contact with non-human intelligence, but they remembered a golden age when their ancestors did, and that's what we find in these ancient stories. In the analysis of such ancient stories, how does an Australian theologian find common ground with an Italian agnostic? Mauro's coming at this as an agnostic, I'm coming at this as a theologian, but we both come to the idea that a lot of religious thinking has been built on mistranslations and misinterpretations of these ancient texts. We have to correct the mistake. If God means the transcendent source of the cosmos, we have to completely separate that from these stories of draconic beings, non-human beings, ancient stories of colonization. They're talking about something completely different. In The Dragons of Eden, Mauro Biglino and I show how the Bible itself tells the story of narrative control. There was a time when the tribes of Israel carried a memory of ancient contact. They talked about the Elohim. They named them Dagon, Milcom, Asherah, Baal Hadad, El Elyon, El Shaddai, Yahweh. And Asherah was commemorated with thanksgiving for her contribution to the advancement of the human condition. But there came a king, Hezekiah, who was a Yahwist. He and his high priest Hilkiah decided that all the tribes of Israel should worship the king's God. And so the memory of all these other beings had to be obliterated. And so the carvings were defaced that shows what they looked like. The Nehushtan that showed what an Elohim like Yahweh looked like had to be destroyed. Temples and altars dedicated to these other Elohim had to be broken up, demolished, the priesthoods rounded up and incinerated so that there would only be one Elohim, and he, Yahweh, and all the others would be hopefully forgotten. Now, the Bible records that shift. There's this ritual reform that rolls out under King Hezekiah. It's referenced again in the book of Ezekiel. And then we get to Hezekiah's grandson Josiah, and he decides that the book of the laws of Yahweh is going to define what his people believe. And so there is a theological reform that follows and a production of scriptures all shaped around this idea of Yahwist monotheism. But there are enough clues in the text, and the change was done with enough transparency that when we get into the Hebrew, we can see the earlier version of Israelite belief. And it was one that carried this ancient memory, a memory which parallels in the cultural story of other tribes and people groups all around the world. Go to Nigeria, listen to the stories of the Efik people, or the Yoruba and Edo people of Nigeria, Benin, Cameroon, or the Zulu people of Southern Africa, ancient Mesopotamians, ancient Mesoamericans, Filipino story, ancient Greek story, Indian story, Norse story, all make the same claim that our ancestors had contact with advanced non-human others who not only nurtured us as a species, but adapted us to be a more useful working class. That's a very strange story to invent if you want to glorify your elders and ancestors, or if you want to glorify the advanced beings of this ancient time. And yet one of the things I love about the Urartian story is that they longed for the return of these mysterious beings they called the Dingir. And the word Dingir means star person or sky person. They looked forward to the Dingir returning for more technology sharing, to take humanity another leap forward into an even better human experience on planet Earth. And I think these stories give us a far more optimistic way of approaching the possibility of contact in the present. If when we think about a populated universe, galactic neighbors turning up, we're only thinking about Mars attacks, invasion of the body snatchers, and Independence Day, we're going to frame everything as existential threat and military security. Our ancestors did not do that, and it comes back to this question of ontological shock. Do we need to be in a state of paralysis and panic when we think about contact today? Our ancestors said no, and they have a very nuanced way of thinking about what contact can mean. Mauro Biglino and I have come together to bring our backgrounds of hermeneutics, Bible translation, to apply to the ancient Hebrew texts. The conclusions we reach you might find very challenging, but my hope is that having read the book, you'll go away with a couple of questions. Have I read that right? How in the world did I ever miss that?